Right, it's 2 minutes after the hour, and I think we'll get started now. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this first virtual lecture from the sponsored by the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies of the academic year 2021-2022. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome our speaker this evening. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of information about how things are going to proceed. We're using a Zoom webinar. And so what we'd ask people to do is that when you to keep with your cameras off and your microphones muted. And Weijia is going to be speaking for about 40, maybe 45 minutes or so on his topic. And at that point, we'll open things up for discussion. You're welcome to put your questions into the Q&A. So not the chat, but use the Q&A. And what I will be doing is moderating this discussion by reading the questions for Weijia. And then we'll have a nice discussion. And so to kick things off, I'd like to first acknowledge our sponsors for the talk this evening. Aside from the Max Kade Institute, we're grateful for the support from the German program within the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, and for the Mossy Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, both here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our speaker this evening is Professor Weijia Li. He's a clinical professor in the School of Education and also the director of the master's program in global higher education. And if you didn't know that, you can recognize it from his background that he's showing there. Professor Li has his doctorate in Germanic studies with a focus on German literature from the Ohio State University. And before he joined the UW-Madison faculty, he taught at Northern Illinois University. And so he's, in addition to his appointment as a clinical professor in the School of Education, he's an affiliate in the German program, the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic Plus, and he's a member of the Faculty Advisory Board for the Max Kade Institute here at Madison. So the title of Professor Li's talk this evening is The German Jewish Diaspora and Its Cross-Pacific Experience from China to the United States. And with that, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Weijia, you to our as our speaker this evening.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction. And I really want to thank Mark and Antje and Max Kade Institute for inviting me to give a lecture. And I'm so happy to see that some of my old colleagues and friends from German programs and also from Jewish studies are here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with me. So let me first share the screen. So before I start to talk about, the subject of this evening's lecture, I would like to invite everyone to take a close look on the picture. I hope it works fine on your screen. And the picture I put on the cover slide of my presentation, and see how many languages can you identify on that picture. Well, this is not a classroom. I'm not going to call anyone's name to give me the answer. It's not meant to be a quiz. But as you can see Chinese characters on the left top corner, and you see United Buildings, that's English. And then you will see the kosher restaurant, but it's like a German word, Restaurant, unter Aufsicht des Rabbi Ashkenazi. So that's a German with Hebrew. But also, just Rabbi Ashkenazi is actually a Russian rabbi at that time in Shanghai. And also in the picture, you probably see someone look like a Chinese businessman, and also at least one or probably even the third person are all European-looking, people. This picture was taken at that time in Shanghai. So with that, I would like to start and with my lecture. 1946, a group of German Jewish refugees arrived here in the United States. With that, they opened a new chapter of their life. In order to understand what it did mean for them as German Jewish refugees to come to the United States, we may have to look into the past. So today, or my lecture is actually focusing on the pre-story of the German Jewish refugees' arrival here in the United States. Shanghai, the Chinese port city, saw an influx of Jewish refugees starting from 1938. To be honest, until today, there's always debate among scholars about exact number of German Jewish refugees who went to Shanghai during World War II. And because people are using different source, there might be some kind of discrepancy. So I'm going to use my version, but feel free to correct me if you see the other versions. My source is actually a internal, let's call it, publication, published by the refugees themselves in Shanghai, where they really recorded everyone's name, address during that time. So according to that report that was only published internally, that's the number I got. So I'm not going to read the number. I hope you can see it. So 1938 was the first year we have more than 1,000 refugees, Jewish refugees arrived in Shanghai from European countries. 1939 is a high time. We have more than 12,000 Jewish refugees arrived to Shanghai. And 1941 was the last year. That's the year that people tend to not agree with each other because people stop keeping record about arrival of refugees. So if I added those numbers together, I would say there are about 19,000 to 20,000 European Jewish refugees came to China at that time. So you probably say I'm switching the different words. For one, I said German Jewish refugees, and then I said European Jewish refugees. So let me explain. The majority of those Jewish refugees, to be accurate, I would say is a German-speaking Jewish refugees. Although not all of them were from Germany, we're talking about Nazi Germany. So there are also Jewish refugees from countries that were invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, but those Jewish refugees did speak German. Only about 2,000 refugees among them are Yiddish-speaking refugees. The rest are all German-speaking refugees. So some scholars tend to use the word Central European Jewish refugees. But for the purpose of tonight's lecture, I would just say German Jewish refugees. But just, by German, I mean they speak German language. So I always got this question, why Shanghai? Right? So, and also people try to explain the reasons. For one, there's nowhere to go. The picture shows you actually a conference. It's called the Evian Conference in France in 1938, led by United States. Most of the country who sent delegates to this conference basically made the decision to close the doors. So basically for German Jewish refugees, there's nowhere to go. And also, most of scholars would explain, on top of that, there's another reason, the second reason, because Shanghai at that time is having a very unique political situation. Namely, Shanghai was occupied by multiple Western nations as a kind of semi-colony. Therefore, nobody has the total control of the entry to that city. Therefore, it basically provides opportunity to travel to Shanghai without like passport or visa, any documents, which is also true. But I'm going to argue, which is tend to be overlooked, a third reason, namely, there was already Jewish diaspora in China, and that those examples shows that the Jewish diaspora was possible. So basically, going to China in order to flee from Nazi Germany was not a new idea. Even in the early 1930s, among the Berlin Jewish communities, people actually talked about the possibility of going to China because they know there was an example of Jewish diaspora existing in China. So let me go into the details to just reiterate what I said. That Shanghai has a very unique political situation. As you see on the picture, and also I provide the timeline. You know, UK, USA, and France, and later on Japan, each of them took a piece of Shanghai. So they occupied part of Shanghai, therefore nobody has the total control of that city. And which create a situation that the Western countries like UK, USA, and France didn't want to enforce the requirement of travel documents for entering Shanghai, because they were afraid if they set this kind of requirement, then the Japanese would also require certain travel documents for entering Shanghai, which would create issues for British, American, or French citizens going to Shanghai. Vice versa, same thing. Japanese government also didn't want to enforce that, travel document requirement, because Japanese were afraid that the other part, their counterpart would also enforce requirements of travel documents, which would create issues for Japanese citizens going to Shanghai. That's why nobody is really doing the passport control. Although on the paper, I mean, by law, it says you need passport or visa in order to go to Shanghai, but nobody is actually, nobody was doing the passport control at that time. Therefore, it created this possibility to go to China. But as I said previously, I think the Jewish diaspora that exists in Shanghai, in China, are very important reason. So I'm giving you 4 examples. On the map, you see I marked the 4 cities. From north, close to Russia, is Harbin, and Tianjin, very close to Beijing, Kaifeng, and Shanghai. I will go by chronological order. There was actually an ancient Jewish community in China, and this is probably the most researched Chinese Jewish community in scholarship, the Kaifeng Jews. We believe that the Kaifeng Jews built their first synagogue in 1163. There were about 400 to approximately 1,000 community members. Unfortunately, that Jewish community is diminished around the middle, or let's say late 19th century. Even though we have to think about that, that means actually a 600 year of history of the local Jewish community in China, in the middle of China. The second largest group in terms of Jewish diaspora in China is the Russian Ashkenazi Jews in Harbin, which is a city very close to Russia. Well, it's obvious that's where the majority of the Jewish community members came from. They built their first synagogue in 1909, and they have about more than 20,000 people at that time. And they had their own newspaper, they had their own theater, opera, everything. Actually, today, the city government of Harbin has been trying to, revital or remain all the Jewish sites. Today, there are 6 different buildings, including a Jewish cemetery, was under the protection of the Harbin city government as Jewish sites to commemorizing the history of Russian Ashkenazi Jews in China. So the picture on the top shows you the synagogue, a new synagogue that was built about 100 years ago, which serves today as a museum of the history of that Jewish community in China. Ehud Olmert, who was the prime minister of Israel between 2006 and 2009, his grandparents came to China as Jewish immigrants and were actually buried in China. And Olmert even visited Harbin, basically to visit the cemetery of the Jewish communities. Now, that's today's main focus, Shanghai. It's a port city in east of China. But the history of local Jewish community actually goes back to quite long ago, in the 19th century. The first group that arrived in Shanghai is Sephardic Jews. We believe their ancestors came from Iraq, but Sephardic Jews came to China as British citizens. The timing is very important. You see it's 1945. That's after China lost the Opium War to the UK. Three most influential Jewish families lived in Shanghai from 1845 to 1945, exactly 100 years. They became very successful in terms of economy and the local influence. The picture you see on the screen shows this Kadori family, Sasson family, and the picture that show kind of the street scene of Shanghai. This is called the Bund. The Bund is, you can still visit today. It looks today pretty much like how the picture shows you. This picture was, I believe, taken in the 1930s. The Bund is like a street in Shanghai that is so important. It's almost like the Michigan Avenue in Chicago, the so-called Magnificent Mile. To just illustrate illustrate the wealth and the influence of this three Jewish family in Shanghai, 2/3 of the properties along this street belong to these three families. And then the second group, we also mentioned previously, Russian Ashkenazi Jews. They actually moved down from Harbin to Tianjin, where they built their first synagogue in 1939. That community had about 3,500 people. And then they keep moving down south, and finally they arrive in Shanghai. But actually they were able to build the synagogue early than the other community in Tianjin. So even in the year 1927, they were able to build their first synagogue, and they have about 4,000 people. So this immigration route basically also shows you the Japanese invasion of China, because Japan took over the whole northeast part of China, and they had a very hostile policy against Russian and the Russian Ashkenazi Jews. So that's why the Russian Ashkenazi Jews felt like the need to move down to south. So by the time when German-speaking Jewish refugees arrived in Shanghai, and followed by about 1,000 Polish Jewish refugees, Shanghai has actually, at that time, actually 4 Jewish communities. The Sephardic Jews that came in around 1945 with about 1,000 members. The Russian Ashkenazi Jews that came in already starting in 1902, they have the time about 6,000, but in most cases they have 4,000 members. The German-speaking Jewish refugees arrived from 1938 to 1941, around at least 18,000 members, and like I said, about 1,000 Jewish refugees from Poland. So that's how the Jewish refugee or Jewish communities in Shanghai look like during the World War II. So going back to the subject of tonight's topic, the German Jewish refugees. The picture show actually they're basically a condition of living in Shanghai. They basically moved to Shanghai. They had to live in the buildings that were abandoned by local Chinese, because China and Shanghai at that time was during the war between China and Japan. So Japan actually have bombarded most of the part of the city. So the Chinese citizens actually abandoned a lot of buildings empty. So the German Jewish refugees actually moved in. Most of the buildings didn't have, kitchen or toilet, bathroom, and very often 3, 5, even 8 families of Jewish refugees had to share one apartment. So we can try our best to imagine the harshness of the refugee life in Shanghai, but regardless how we try, it's hard to believe, how to survive in that city for Jewish refugees. But eventually, they were thinking Shanghai is just a waiting room because their destination, their final destination is the United States. Most of the Jewish refugees were planning to immigrate to the United States because the Pacific War broke out and the transportation route was cut off. Therefore, they had to stay in Shanghai. And so then they have realized no one can tell how soon the war would be over. So after about 2 years, they switched their mindset from considering Shanghai as the temporary waiting room to a place where they can try to normalize the life as refugees, at least to attempt to return to the normal life. So soon in the areas where Jewish refugees, German Jewish refugees settled down, they create the German type of bakery, the Vienna type of coffee house, and they were able to share the Jewish school as kind of a general support from the other two Jewish communities. So that moment is about 1942. I think it's a critical moment that the German Jewish refugees realized that they have to switch the attitude from surviving in a waiting room to attempts to return to normal life. And exactly at that moment, the cultural life among the Jewish refugees boomed. They start to publish their own newspaper. I basically, in the last almost 80 years, I spent most of my time to collect newspapers published by Jewish communities, mostly the German Jewish communities in Shanghai. I have collected a total about, 5,000 copies, and I counted about 18 different newspapers. Most of them were published in German language. 2 of them were published in Yiddish. To just give you some overview about their cultural life. They also created their own orchestra. They even had their own theater group. Actually, there were 2 theater groups. One is a German theater group, another one is Yiddish theater group. And probably because my work at the School of Education and my interest in global higher education or international higher education, I paid more attention to a very specific person, Weijia Li, who was a German Jewish refugee, born and grew up in Berlin. And he went to college in Berlin and majored in Chinese studies, if I use today's language. So he was one of the very, very few German Jewish refugees who was fluent in Chinese. The reason I'm very interested in his work during that time is because he tried to recreate a Volkshochschule, or People's University, or in today's language, it's almost like an American community college, but solely designed for German Jewish refugees, so for his fellow refugees. And he believed that the mission of this People's University, which he called Asia Seminar, is dissemination of Asiatic knowledge and modern science, promotion of international collaboration and universal understanding among different nations, and preservation of Jewish cultural heritage and the tradition. So basically the 3 most important foundations in the mission statement. Weijia Li created the Asia Seminar and also managed to offer multiple courses, lectures. Most of the courses and lectures were also taught by Jewish refugees. He also created a logo for his Asia Seminar. And I would like to ask you to take a look at this logo. that he used almost everywhere, especially in, the picture shows a brochure. This is almost like a course catalog in today's language, basically showcase what courses were offered each semester. So on every copy of this course catalog, you can see the logo. Can you tell if there's any religious symbols that are incorporated in this logo? This is a quiz for you. See how many points can you score. I will give you some time, then I'm going to review the answer key. Okay, time is up. Now here's the answer, and see how many points have you scored. For each religious symbol you are able to identify, you get 1 point. First, there's the Chinese yin and yang, which is the symbol for Tao or Taoism. And the Greek god of Madison. The tree of wisdom or tree of knowledge in the Bible. And the Ankh, the key of breath or key of life or key of Nile of Isis, the Egyptian goddess. Then you will see the whole symbol is put within a black circle, if I may put it this way. That symbolizes the universe. You may think that that's my interpretation. No, that's Willy Tong's interpretation or his design ideas, which I was able to find in the archive in the Leo Baeck Institute in New York City. This is his handwriting, drawn on the back of a cigarette package paper, where he basically explained what symbol each of the symbol means in German, but also the whole structure is also identical with the AST, so Asia Seminar and the Tong, and his last name. And he also wrote alles zusammen in der Welt, so all together in the world, so in the universe. So what did Asia Seminar offer in terms of courses? So I was able to collect most of the copies of the course catalog for all the years. And to just give you some examples, each semester, there were about 48 lectures offered. By lecture, I mean, it's not like what I'm doing right now. It's just one-time lecture. It's not like a lecture the student have to go in, every Friday or every Monday. That's why they are able to offer 48 lectures each semester. Most of them are delivered in German. The subjects actually cross all kinds of disciplines, but also interestingly, because Willy Tong's own interest and the training in Chinese studies, there were also 53 China-related lectures delivered between 1944 and 1947. 2 of these lectures were actually about the Jewish diaspora in China, the history, and so on. On the right side, to just give you some concrete example about those lectures, such as there's Chinese art history, Japanese mythology, but there's also sex psychology, something in the political science crisis of nationalism, but also in STEM field, right? In today's language, nutrition, chemistry, even experimental cell research. So it's really a modern day community college type of adult education institution. After World War II, especially in the year 1946, German Jewish refugees have realized that now the possibility of the further immigration, namely to their final destination to the United States, is alive again. And among the Jewish refugees, there's suddenly a huge interest in planning the so-called further immigration to the United States. Wellington was able to catch this kind of demand among the German Jewish refugees. Starting fall semester 1946, Wellington started to focus mostly on offering of English courses. So in that semester, the Asia seminar was offering 3 levels, or in today's language, 3 different courses, a total enrollment of 200 students. Again, all these students are German Jewish refugees. And seeing more fellow refugees able to immigrate to the United States, the demand of learning English language was getting bigger and bigger. So summer 1947, 6 English courses were offered with a total of 13 sections and more than 700 students each semester. Again, all the students are Jewish refugees who were planning further immigration to the United States. And Wellington soon realized the fellow Jewish refugees were not only satisfied with, kind of English proficiency, but they really want to be ready for the new chapter of their life in the United States. So there is also the need to be able to understand the United States from all kinds of aspects. So Wellington actually converted all these English courses to a new kind of institution and renamed as American Seminary. And that American Seminary, starting in 1946, actually offered lectures on American culture and society. So far, I was able to find 6 lectures that were rotating each semester. So all the 6 were offered at the same semester, but they're rotating in terms of topic. I assume there must be more lectures, but so far, based on my archive research in the last couple of years, these are the 6 I was able to identify and also trace back to, at what point, what lecture was offered. So there's American way of life, American geography, American economics, American citizenship, American literature, and the relations between America and China. So you can tell that the people were trying to get ready, like I said, for a new chapter of their life. The picture here on this slide shows a group of German Jewish refugees arrived in San Francisco, 1946. So there are 2 questions I would say that remained unanswered. And I'm still sometimes spending some time to think about it. So what did the United States mean to the German Jewish refugees who prefer to call themselves immigrants instead of refugees? We especially talk about their next journey from China to the United States. Reading all the newspapers published by Jewish refugees between 1945 and 1948, one thing is clear. They stopped using the word refugee. Immigrant. Immigrant is the word they were using, and immigrants probably are the identities they are assigning to themselves. I was trying to find out all the articles where Jewish refugees or immigrants talk about the United States. Actually, there were not many. I guess mentally, this is the final destination This is the final destination even before they went to China. So when this opportunity suddenly presented itself, that they were able to go to the final destination, but they just experienced the harshness of refugee life for almost 10 years. And they were still trying to make sense about World War II and start to learn more about what happened in Nazi Germany to their friends, family, relatives who were not able to escape Nazi terror. It seems to me that the majority of the German Jewish immigrants were not mentally ready to process what United States mean to them. Although everybody is thrilled about the possibility to open a new chapter in their life, but what that exactly means, it's hard to tell. Like I said, so far I couldn't find any article that is really go into that. So I think probably if we just think about a time of period between 1946, 1948, like I said, probably there's no room and the opportunity for the Jewish refugees to really to make sense about what United States could mean to them. Another question is, how did the Shanghai German Jewish refugees, or immigrants in this case, view their German identities? For the local Chinese, those German Jewish refugees were mostly viewed as Europeans. In the eyes of their religious brothers and sisters of Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, they were German first. But the German Jewish refugees, from beginning of their life in China, try to distinguish themselves from other Europeans for two reasons. One, they want to emphasize their Jewish identities. That's the reason they came to China. But also that's the reason they were different from other Europeans, because the other Europeans, except those other Jewish immigrants, most of the Europeans in Shanghai, we talk about Britons, Americans, French people, Japanese, they were the colonial power. They enjoyed the extra territorial privileges. Unlike the German Jewish refugees, they were refugees. So there's a kind of interplay among the different identities, being German, being Jewish, being refugee, being immigrants. I don't think we have enough time, and I don't have enough evidence to go deeper, but I would like to invite everyone to think about more about these two questions. Before I conclude my lecture tonight, I would like to show you this picture. You can find this picture actually at the United States Holocaust Museum. The picture actually shows that those are the Jewish refugees in Shanghai after 1946. Every morning, they got up, they stand in front of a kind of name list released by Jewish refugee relief committees, basically trying to find if their friends, their family members, their relatives who are also Jewish, who are not able to escape from Nazi terror. The list basically shows those people who survived the Holocaust. Imagine what kind of feeling that was. You got up every early morning, you went to see a name list, and you hope you can find someone's name. A picture taken on July 18th, 1937. Many of you may think, oh, this is a Nazi parade. Yes, it's sort of. It's actually taken in this country, the New Jersey division of German American Bond. So I was always asking myself, did German Jewish refugees in Shanghai know about this? Around the same time on Long Island, did German Jewish refugees in Shanghai, China know what was going on in the United States at that time? Some people thought, oh, this must be the Reichsparteitag in Nuremberg. No. It's in New York City. In 1939, that was a time that German Jewish refugees desperately tried to leave Nazi Germany. That was a time that Shanghai, China was the only place that provided kind of a resort or rescue. And that was a time that the German-American bond held such a, let's call it, rally in a major city here in the United States. I would like to conclude my lecture with some modern day flavor. Today, if you go to Shanghai, if you have time, I highly recommend you to visit the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, which is housed within the synagogue owned by the Sephardic Jews and generously provided to the German Jewish refugees. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu visited the museum. The picture in the middle shows that when he was in China. The picture on the left side, left down corner, shows an old man, Michael Blumenthal, US Secretary of Treasury under President Jimmy Carter. Michael Blumenthal was one among the 18 or 19,000 German Jewish refugees in Shanghai. He went to Shanghai when he was 13 years old. He left China after World War II and immigrated to the United States, and later on became the Secretary of Treasury. I would also like to bring to you a local hero, Rabbi Swasinski. He was also a Jewish refugee, fled Nazi terror. He was able to immigrate to the United States directly without going from the Chinese route. He was a founding rabbi of the synagogue Temple Beth El here in Madison, Wisconsin. I was introduced to him and his work, and I was fortunate to get to know his children. When the former president of this country was talking about building walls, an idea that was celebrated and also put in action by his senior advisor, Stephen Miller. who was also descendant of European Jewish refugee. Why I'm telling you this? Because Rabbi Swasinski wrote in 1980, I quote, "To endure, mankind needs to build bridges, not walls. Bridges between man and man, bridges between faith and faith, bridges between race and race, bridges between nation and nation." Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Weijia, for a really fashion. And we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. I invite folks to put their questions into the Q&A. You could also raise your virtual hand and I could unmute you and call on you that way too. But we've already got one question coming from Peggy Haas. And Peggy's question is, were living conditions for the Chinese in Shanghai much better than they were for the Jewish refugees from 1939 to the 1940s?
Thank you for this wonderful question. Absolutely not. Actually, there's a kind of internal refugees in China. So many of the local Chinese had to escape from that war in the port city and basically a kind of internal immigration to other Chinese cities. But from, I have some maps, but I couldn't share here. I have to look for it. But if you look at any of the historical maps during that time, you will see that the Japanese bombed quite significantly certain areas in Shanghai. Most of the areas were previously residence area of Chinese citizens. And so when the Chinese citizens left that area, the German Jewish refugees basically moved in, or I would say out of no choice. That's why the area where Jewish refugees were living was actually within the Japanese control. That's why Japanese was able to force all the Jewish refugees move together in 1943 in order to create the so-called designated area for stateless refugees, because Nazi Germany basically took away all the refugee citizenship. So those German refugees became the only refugees in Shanghai that were deemed as stateless. I hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you. Elaine Rosenblatt asks, how did this become your focus of study?
Thank you for the question. It's almost like a soul search. Actually, well, that's a very good question. I started to look into this topic, Shanghai Jewish refugees, in 2010. After I published my dissertation as a book, I was looking for a new topic. And actually, my dad was from Shanghai. And he told me that used to be German refugees lived in Shanghai. So I didn't pay attention when I was a child. Until that year, 2010, I started to look for a new topic. Somehow, I couldn't remember why, but somehow I was thinking maybe there's something worthy for me to explore. Then basically from that year until almost like 2019, almost 9 years, I just spent a lot of time on this topic. But because I'm not a historian, I'm more interested in the texts and the works that Jewish refugees created and put out during their diaspora in Shanghai. There have been books written by historians about their life in Shanghai, why they went to Shanghai, and how they left China. So if you're interested, just Google. There are quite some books about German Jewish refugees in Shanghai, all made by historians. I was trying to focus on the cultural or the education aspects of the German Jewish diaspora during World War II.
Great, thank you. And Cy Kryline has a question regarding Willy Ton. Did Willy Ton have total latitude or freedom to develop the seminary and the courses? Or was there external control by the Chinese to determine course content?
Okay, I think we have a modern day concern about academic freedom. Yes, he has total control because, like I said, in Shanghai, nobody has total control. The Chinese government had long withdrawn from Shanghai. Shanghai is basically under the Japanese control after 1941. So again, prior to 1941, China and Japan were having war. But after 1941, Shanghai was under total control of the Japanese government. Because of that, Willy Ton could do anything as long as it's within the Jewish refugee community. So the courses are taught by Jewish refugees. All students are Jewish refugees. So basically that creates a kind of a silo, but also an insulation against any kind of local authority. That's why Willy Ton was able to put out all the different course offerings.
Great, thank you. Here's a question that comes from Maria Sturm. She asks, does Weijia know the novel Shanghai Fern von Wo by Ursula Krechel? And if so, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the novel. I also read it. I cannot make any evaluation. I didn't focus on the literary representation of that history. But actually, it's a shame to admit, I actually tried to collect all the novels about Shanghai Jewish refugees, written in all languages, being the English, German, and regardless whether they are good or not good. So I collect about, I don't know, 24 novels, but I didn't have time to read all of them. So it's hard for me to give evaluation or my own opinion about the literary representation. But because it's now, I think it's a literary representation of that history. But I'm glad you asked this question. I also want to bring in another totally different aspect. There are quite some memoir or autobiographies published based on the memory of some of the Shanghai Jewish refugees. Again, you could find some of them very popular here, both in the library, probably also here. I believe our university library has at least 3 or 4 of those books. But there's a huge difference between the 2 different generations among the Jewish refugees. Those who went to China as adults and those who went to China as kids. I always want to remind people the books you are reading about their experience in China will mostly come from the refugees who went to China as kids. Very young, 5 years old, 6 years old. Many of them had admitted at the beginning was difficult, but it's fun. It's almost like adventure. So their attitude towards survival, towards the Jewish survival in China, is completely different from their parents' generation. So all I'm saying is when you read those novels, you have to remind yourself, novels or biographies, you have to remind yourself, we are reading refugees' memory of their time in China, written by the younger generation who went to China as kids, are young children who was able to even go to the Jewish school in Shanghai. Unlike their parents, they lost their jobs, they lost their belongings. They went to China, try to sustain a minimum of life standard. And without knowing how the future would look like, and many Jewish refugees, especially men, had to deal with kind of guilt and shame. But the younger generation didn't have this kind of experience. That's why you don't read those from those memoirs or let's say novels. I just want to emphasize.
Interesting. So Fran Lupke asked the question, or she shares the story. She once met a German ambassador to the United States whose family left Shanghai and emigrated to South Africa. Do you know how many Jews took that route? In other words, leaving Shanghai but heading to other places like South Africa?
That's a very good question. So we said that there's about at least 18,000 German-speaking Jewish refugees in Shanghai, and I said that might be even more than that. Among all these German-speaking Jewish refugees, we know there were at least around 7,000 of them immigrated to the United States. Another group of them immigrated to Canada or Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have exact numbers. We truly believe the group that immigrated to the United States is the largest group. Interestingly, there were anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000, again, we don't have the exact number, 2,000 to 4,000 refugees who actually decide going back to Germany after World War II. Some of them went back to the West Germany. Some of them went back to the East Germany, the socialist East Germany. Willy Tong and another, we believe, more than 2,000 Jewish refugees went to Israel. And Willy Tong's dream was to create the first East Asian Studies department at an Israeli university. Unfortunately, he died in a very early age, and he was not able to put his dream into action. We also believe there are also Jewish refugees went to South Africa, even probably some countries, Latin America. We just have very little information and also no accurate number at all.
Thank you.
And also there were, we guess, around 50 Jewish refugees who decide to stay in China.
Are there any descendants of those people still living in China today?
The local government in Shanghai was able to identify one family so far. I believe it was a German Jewish man who married a local Chinese woman.
Interesting. So we've got two questions that I'm going to merge together from Kaushik Sen. His first part of his question was, how did the Jewish refugees in Shanghai get along with each other, sort of within the community? And this really fascinates me too, because it's something that I noticed, or it's connected to something that I noticed in the Willy Tong Asia seminar offers. So Kaushik asks, there were Jewish refugees from Europe, also in Singapore and in India. In fact, both the Sassoon and Kaduri families that you mentioned, of those three families, had branches in India and Singapore. Was there any interaction between the Jewish community in Shanghai with those in Singapore and India? And I'm going to tack on to that also, I noticed that in the list of courses, language courses that were offered, in addition to like German and Hebrew and English, there was also Pali, I believe, maybe also Sanskrit. So there's clearly some sort of a connection there with South Asia, right, with India. So what's the sort of potential connection there between, say, other refugees in Singapore and India, and maybe also the Indian?
Let me first start with the language course, Pali and Sanskrit. I don't have enough evidence, but I guess those courses were probably taught by Willy Tong himself, because he learned all these Asian languages, including Tibetan and Sanskrit, back in Berlin. I so far haven't identified any refugee instructors who were able to teach such a language. So again, so far all the evidence indicated that those courses were taught by refugees themselves. Now, going back to how they got along with each other, we have to remind ourselves, the Sephardic Jews never look at themselves as refugees. They came in with privilege as British citizen. That's why they enjoy the extraterritorial privilege. The Russian Ashkenazi Jews also never look at themselves as refugees. They were immigrants back in Harbin. So, I mean, both the Sephardic Jews and Russian Ashkenazi Jews did their best to support the German and the Polish Jewish refugees. But in terms of the interaction, there was minimal interaction between the Sephardic Jews and the German Jewish refugees. For one, because the different tradition, cultural tradition. For two, because of different language. Sephardic Jews only speaks English in China. They don't speak German. Russian Ashkenazi Jews got along very, very well with Polish Jews because they share the same language, Yiddish. And they have much more interaction with each other than between any other two Jewish groups in Shanghai. In terms of the connection with Singapore and India, Sephardic Jews actually came from India to China. So they definitely still have their network connections in India. Actually, many of their employees were actually hired by their family from India and then sent to Shanghai to oversee their, a branch business and so on. So that connection was still there, not only Singapore, India, but also very important Hong Kong. So most of Sephardic Jews came to China as British citizens. They always stop first in Hong Kong to get used to the Chinese culture or get some information. Then they will go further to Shanghai. So that's about how the network and the connection with each other look like during that time.
Great, thank you. Here's a quick question from Cy Kryline. He has been to Shanghai and he's very impressed by the Bund, or the Bund, however it's pronounced. Is that a coincidence? I mean, you came up with the word Bund a couple of times in very different contexts. Is in fact that the German Bund, the name Bund, or where's that word come from in Shanghai?
To be honest, I really don't know. I think that if you speak English, you call it Bund. The German Jewish at that time probably called Bund. I guess that is from the early colonial time. So I really don't know. I guess that's a English imitation of a local Chinese word, but I don't know how that came out. But it definitely has nothing to do with German language. I shouldn't pronounce it as Bund. I probably should say Bund. But another thing that reminds me, many of the Jewish refugees who immigrated to the United States, we're talking about especially among those younger generation who are now in their probably 80s, 70s, 80s. I met some of them. They call themselves Shanghai Lander. But the original meaning of Shanghai Lander is actually the British colonial power in Shanghai. They call them Shanghai Lander. The Shanghai Lander means that you are a British person coming to China for the purpose of adventure. And hopefully you can get a wealthy, rich, and at least some wonderful experience you can brag about when you go back to the UK. That's the original meaning of Shanghai Lander. But somehow the German Jewish refugees adopt that word and that they call themselves Shanghai Lander. But I don't think they think about the colonial perspective. Rather, they are those who lived in Shanghai and they knew Shanghai very well. I think that's what they meant. And there used to be even a Shanghai Lander reunion every 2 or 3 years, where those, again, the younger generation of Jewish refugees, they grouped together and went back to Shanghai to visit all the remaining sites of the Jewish refugee history in China.
Interesting. And actually kind of connecting with the modern present. So Peggy Haas also asks, those people who now attend the synagogue in Shanghai, in other words, Jews who are living in Shanghai today, when did they come to China and where did they come from? Do we know how many Jews live in Shanghai now? What's the Jewish presence in Shanghai today?
Nowadays, actually, all the Jewish people living in Shanghai are mostly Israeli citizens. They come to China mostly for trade, for education, for cultural exchange, for doing business. And they have their own organization, they have their cultural club, and they have their own synagogue. But it's only maintained with their own community. So it's a Jewish organization, I would say, but you can also consider as a mostly Israeli cultural organization in Shanghai. I believe there's a similar one in Beijing.
Interesting. And I'm assuming that the Chabad movement is also, I know that they're in China. They're probably in Shanghai as well. Is that correct? The Chabad?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And then Kaushik Sen also asks, in Shanghai, there was also a French colonial section. Were there any Jews from France, like French speaking Jews in Shanghai?
To be honest, I don't know. But I'm glad you mentioned that. The French concession is considered as the nicest area in Shanghai. So when the German Jewish refugees and the Polish Jewish refugees went to Shanghai, they would first try to see whether they can get an apartment in the French zone or the French concession. Some of the Yiddish-speaking Polish Jewish refugees were able to find apartments in the French zone, thanks to the help of the Russian Ashkenazi Jews. Because Russian Ashkenazi Jews, many of them, actually I would say the majority of them, lived in the French zone. But 1943, Japanese authority created the so-called designated area for stateless refugees. So they forced all the Jewish refugees to move out of the French zone, to move to the probably I would say the worst area in Shanghai, so that the Japanese already have better control of all the refugees.
Well, we're just about out of time, and this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Weijia, obviously, first and foremost, for a really, really fascinating talk. And thanks to everybody who attended this evening. And if you're not on our mailing list already, please let us know, and we'd be happy to put you on our email list and let you know about other virtual lectures. We're despite kind of moving out of the pandemic, one of the things that the silver linings of it for the Max Kade Institute is to actually have these Zoom lectures where we can have people from all over the country and even around the world. So this year we're planning on having pretty much in a rhythm about one virtual lecture a month. So if you're interested in getting on our email list, we'd be happy, and you're not already on it, we'd be happy to add it. But again, Weijia, thank you so much for a really, really interesting presentation. Appreciate your coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you.